was already introduced earlier, so I won't say too much anymore, but I think Virgin itself is a quite interesting airline. He is a relatively newcomer to the industry, although not to the IT industry, but to the airline industry. But I think he's taken up the task quite nicely, and they're innovating. And the two other gentlemen here are experts for many, many years into this. Olivier I just introduced already, so I'm not going to repeat it. And Samuel here has been since day one of Vueling, and used to work before as well as for Airlines and for Iberia. So he's been 13 years in the industry. It's quite significant experience. And each of them brings in a different perspective, because you get Virgin, which is probably a more full service type carrier. You have Brussels, which is probably in the mix somewhere in between, and Vueling, which is a low cost. So I'd actually like to bring a few questions to the gentlemen. And maybe the first one is if each of you can just, there's two microphones here, if each of you can maybe just give a bit of an overview of what your IT landscape looks like, just 1 or 2 minutes for the people of a bit of an introduction. You want to start?
Sure. Well, Vueling being, we call ourselves a new generation airline, and we're pretty young. We've had the opportunity of growing without many legacy systems, so our landscape is I think it's good in terms of flexibility, because we can build our infrastructure and systems around our current needs, and while some other legacy systems might have to deal with older systems. So what we see is that we need to be very flexible and quick in order to gain some competitive advantage compared to other airlines. And we have to be sure that we measure everything into very little detail, and I'll tell you why. In the old days that I didn't believe, because I'm too young yet, but it was, the systems were working or not working. So you were distributing over the GDSs. You should concentrate on your operations to make differentiation with other competitors. But nowadays, if your website is responding 1 second slower than other websites, you might be losing a booking. If you're integrating with an online travel agency in a worst way, you may not appear on that list. So that means that IT is very important for distribution. So in our case, we are measuring everything into this little detail, and that makes life, I think, more difficult than it was some years ago for IT guys.
Okay, David, from a Virgin perspective?
Sure. Virgin has the image of a young airline, but we hit 30 years this year, and that means 30 years of legacy. So I have everything in the estate, from AS400s to flavors of Oracle, from Oracle 8 upwards, and in terms of hardware, you name it, I've got it. But since I've come, we've been going through a fairly major transformation. Part of that is, as I mentioned this morning, we're going to be going through a change of PSS, which allows me to substantially look at my estate, decommission a large number of old applications and all the rest. But potentially even more importantly, we're moving from a scenario where we have traditionally had hosted computer rooms filled with equipment that we owned, to a scenario where I'm moving to a new supplier and we are renting services. That means I have to change how I operate IT. We have to look at our operations differently. We have to procure differently. And it's a multi-stage process where my end goal within 5 years is to be very cloud-based.
Okay. And Brussels?
Yeah, so for Brussels Airlines, it's a little bit the same. We come from Sabina, so we always say we are a young company, but we have 75 years of experience, and the systems are that old as well. No, 93% of the budget in IT is outsourced, so we are changing PSSs as well, so we'll benefit from newer technology, but all of that is all with the people who know how to operate a PSS. And we have, inside the IT departments, we have actually subject matter expert without our contract manager who are managing SLAs and KPIs. So our objective is to ensure that we have quality of service throughout the service that is being given. Now, IT has a portfolio of services that we can offer. I explained the part earlier on, but when it goes from connectivity network, hosting that is a private cloud or a public cloud, we have identified a partner which we then source globally, which we measure then by SLA and KPIs.
Okay. Just as an idea, as all of you are using a hosted PSS environment somewhere, does that actually mean, and many of the other applications being outsourced as well, from a budget perspective, you actually have a probably significant amount of fixed cost. Does that give you a lot of flexibility to try to cut cost out of the organization or to be more efficient?
Yeah, that's why we're doing the change we're going through right now is absolutely that, to move from a very fixed cost basis to variable.
Okay.
And we're trying to change, well, we are successfully changing our contracts to be a more variable based on some of the inputs that we have. So moving towards passenger boarded fees and the like in terms of our IT infrastructure.
Okay.
In our case, our cost is I would say it's almost 100% variable. It's based on how many bookings we do. Obviously, to survive, we have to make bookings, so you can consider it fixed. But in any case, our IT, our OPEX versus revenue is half where it is in the industry.
Okay.
The way we achieve that is to making sure that we only implement and use whatever we need, instead of like bringing great and fancy systems from the very beginning. We only go to those systems when they are really needed. So, for example, it was not until we were big enough that we decided to set up a proper vertical revenue accounting system, because we could live with more simple systems, and that obviously reduces the cost, because this is a must for airlines such as Vueling, where we have to keep those costs very low.
Okay.
Yeah, there's an important aspect about Brussels Airlines that we're a member of the Lufthansa group. So when we're changing PSS, of course, we're streamlining with the group, and then therefore we can beneficiate from the group effect of streamlining processes and in terms of invoicing, obviously, as well. But somehow this can have a downturn as well, because you don't have the full flexibility that you would expect if you want to change something as an airline on your side. You need to bring this to the group. So what is an advantage on one side can be a downturn on another side.
Yeah. But that leads to our next interesting question, specifically for Vueling and for Brussels Airlines, as you are part of the IAG group, you're part of the Lufthansa group. Do you have a lot of flexibility yourself on IT, or is the group more or less deciding for you how you have to run the show?
I'm happy to say that I have full flexibility.
Okay.
We can benefit from some synergies, especially on the procurement side of things, because we are part of the group, so we've got more power to have better deals. But we're completely independent, and actually this flexibility is what let us do things in different ways.
Do you have to provide interlining capabilities with Iberia and BA? Or?
Yes, this is part of the functionality that we do.
Okay.
Yeah, for the Lufthansa group, the strategy until recently has always been it's a multi-brand, multi-hub. So everybody has a different reality. It's different companies. So we were always free to pick up the providers and the solution that we wanted. Now, obviously, sometimes for strategic reason, we decide to go together on the same boat for the same system. So sometimes we have the choice. We can pick solutions from the group. Sometimes we can beneficiate from the volume effect of the Lufthansa group. So, for instance, when we need to buy Microsoft licenses, when we need to acquire some hardware, well, we can use the group numbers. But when it comes to other processes, we can actually launch our own RFPs and make our own decisions.
Okay. And it's maybe a question for yourself and for Virgin as well. Means, as both of you are moving PSS, actually for what kind of periods and what's the impact to the organization? Because it's probably one of the most serious pieces of surgery an airline can think about. And as Emirates, we actually went through a process over the last 2 years to think about doing the same. We decided not to do it, but I think when I looked at it, the cost what it was, it's in the hundreds of millions for a company like us. was in the hundreds of millions of dollars of impact what it actually would do to actually make it work.
Yeah, it'll be our biggest investment over the next probably 5 years is doing this change. We have a timeline currently that'll take us 2 years to complete, and it will mean retraining, certainly in terms of non-onboard staff. About 80% of our staff will need retraining in some shape or form. So it's a massive business change.
But does that mean that in the period of time of your customer innovation, we'll probably have to slow down a little?
That's a good question. Actually, we're hoping to speed it up. So, some of the customer innovation will come from the PSS change. But because the onboard staff are relatively unaffected, we're looking at some quite substantial customer experience changes, but outside of probably the airport and customer servicing areas.
That makes sense.
Okay, for Brussels Airlines, we were a bit more lucky because we have the group effect. Because the PSS migration is being led by Swiss, because Swiss is actually doing the same as well. So we see that many times, for instance, for flight planning system as well, Swiss, Austrian and Brussels Airlines decided to go together to the same flight planning system. So obviously you always have resources that you can share, and so the impact on the company is a little bit less. Now, changing a PSS is something that touches transversally the whole company. So we have a 2-year impact. So we had a very big exercise on our resource allocation committee to decide to reprioritize all the projects to make some space for the PSS migration.
Okay. I want to open it up to the floor. Is there any specific questions for the three gentlemen? I know everybody wants to go home probably, but any questions? Any questions you have for each other? Or I don't want to keep people here if people are all desperate to leave the show. No? Okay, in that case, I want to thank you for your participation, and this is the last part of the panel. And I specifically